I haven't slept in 3 years, Adrian Blackthorne once confessed to no one. The words swallowed by the cold stone walls of his own chamber as the wind pressed against the tall windows like a restless ghost. And yet on the night she arrived, without warning, without invitation, something within that silence shifted. The Blackthorne estate stood miles from the nearest village, a place people spoke of only in lowered voices, where candles burned longer than laughter and every corridor carried the weight of something unfinished, and Adrian moved through it like a man already half gone, his presence commanding yet hollow, his steel-gray eyes fixed on duties that required no feeling, no memory, no risk of breaking again, until the carriage wheels crunched against frozen gravel and a slight figure stepped down, her coat too thin for the biting cold, her boots worn from roads that did not forgive weakness. Eliza Whitmore had not come by choice, but by necessity, her last option in a world that had offered her none, and when the heavy doors opened to receive her, the warmth inside felt less like comfort and more like entering something that had forgotten how to breathe. The staff barely acknowledged her, their glances sharp, dismissive, as if she were already a mistake waiting to be corrected, and perhaps she was, because when Adrian first saw her, standing small yet unshaken beneath the towering ceilings, he did not see fragility. He saw intrusion, something out of place in a world he had carefully emptied of anything that could reach him. "You won't last a week," he said, his voice low, controlled, the kind of voice that did not need to rise to command silence. And yet she did not flinch, did not argue, did not plead. She simply lowered her gaze with quiet dignity and answered, "Then I will make the week count." And something about that answer lingered longer than it should have. The days that followed did not welcome her. The halls remained cold, the whispers sharper, and yet Eliza moved through them with a calm that unsettled more than defiance ever could. She fixed what others ignored, a loose hinge, a dying plant, a forgotten book left open as if waiting for someone who never returned, small things, invisible things, and still Adrian noticed. Though he told himself he did not care, told himself she was temporary, like everything else. But on the third night, when the storm rolled in hard enough to rattle the glass and pull shadows deeper into the corners of his room, he found himself awake again, as always, staring into the dark that refused to release him, until a faint sound reached him from down the corridor, not loud, not urgent, just present. And for reasons he did not question, he followed it, step by measured step, until he found her in the dim light of a single candle, sitting quietly as she mended something torn, her expression calm, untouched by the heaviness that consumed everything else in that house. And when she looked up and met his gaze, there was no fear there, no pity, only a stillness that did not demand anything from him. And for the first time and longer than he could remember, the silence did not feel like an enemy. Pressing against his chest, it felt like something else, something dangerously close to peace. And Adrian Blackthorne, who had mastered the art of enduring, found himself standing there longer than he intended, as if leaving would break something fragile he did not yet understand. The next morning arrived without ceremony, as it always did at Blackthorne Estate. Pale light filtering through tall windows that had not been opened in years, and Adrian stood exactly where he had been the night before, though he could not remember when he had finally closed his eyes, only that something in the darkness had loosened its grip, leaving behind a quiet that felt unfamiliar, almost unwelcome in its gentleness. And when he descended the grand staircase, the house resumed its usual rhythm of silence and restraint, servants moving carefully, voices lowered, as if the walls themselves demanded obedience. Yet there was a difference he could not name, something subtle, like a note out of place in a well-practiced symphony, and he found it in the far corridor near the eastern wing, where Eliza Whitmore knelt beside a narrow table, carefully arranging a stack of books that had long been left to gather dust, her fingers moving with deliberate care, as though each object mattered, even in a place where nothing seemed to hold value beyond function. And Adrian paused without intention, watching as she adjusted the spine of one worn volume until it aligned perfectly with the others, a small act, insignificant by any reasonable measure, and yet it unsettled him more than defiance ever could, because it suggested a belief that something here was still worth preserving, and he had long abandoned that belief himself. "You are wasting your time," he said at last, his voice breaking the stillness with quiet authority, and she looked up, not startled, not hurried, simply present in a way that refused to bend under the weight of his tone. "Perhaps," she answered, her voice soft but steady. "But some things only remain broken because no one stops to care." And the simplicity of her words lingered in the space between them, not as a challenge, but as a truth he had no immediate defense against, and for a moment, neither moved. The distance between them filled not with tension, but with something quieter, something more dangerous, the possibility of being seen. Adrian turned away first, as he always did when something came too close, retreating into the familiar structure of his day: meetings, accounts, decisions that required precision but no feeling. Yet the image of her remained, not intrusive, not overwhelming, but persistent, like a thought that refused to be dismissed. And by evening, when the sky darkened into a deep, endless gray, he found himself returning to the eastern wing without reason he could justify. The corridors colder there, less used, as though time itself had slowed, and there she was again, seated near the window with a single candle flickering beside her, reading quietly, her posture relaxed, her presence unguarded. And he realized then that she did not move through this house as others did. Careful, restrained, she existed within it as though it did not have the power to define her, and that difference disturbed him more than he was willing to admit. "Why are you still here?" he asked, the question sharper than intended, and she closed the book with a soft sound, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Because I was asked to stay," she replied, then after a brief pause. "And because leaving does not always mean finding somewhere better." And something in that answer struck deeper than he expected, echoing in a place he had sealed long ago, and Adrian, who had spent years ensuring that nothing within these walls could reach him again, found himself standing there, caught between the instinct to retreat and the unfamiliar urge to remain, as though the quiet she carried had begun to alter the very air around him, and he did not yet know whether that change was something to resist or something he had already begun to need. That night, the house seemed to listen, as though every wall and corridor had begun to notice the quiet shift that neither of them spoke of, and Adrian found himself lingering longer than necessary outside the eastern wing, his hand resting briefly against the cold stone as if grounding himself before stepping forward, a hesitation that would have been unthinkable days before, yet now it felt inevitable, like a path he had already begun to walk without realizing it. And when he entered, he found the candle already lit, its flame steady despite the draft that crept beneath the old window frames. And Eliza stood there this time, not seated, her attention focused on a small wooden box resting on the table, its surface worn with age, the edges softened by time and careful handling. And for a moment he did not speak, because he knew that box, knew it in a way that tightened something deep in his chest, a relic from a life he had buried with deliberate precision. And yet here it was, uncovered, not carelessly, not intrusively, but simply present in her hands as she traced the grain of the wood with quiet curiosity. "You should not touch that," he said, his voice lower than before, not sharp, but edged with something more fragile than anger. And she stilled immediately, her fingers withdrawing as she looked up at him, not defensive, not apologetic, only aware. "I did not mean to overstep," she replied softly. It was left open, and the explanation was simple, without excuse, without justification. And somehow that made it harder to dismiss, because it was true. The box had been left open, as though some part of him had already allowed this moment to happen. Adrian crossed the distance between them with measured steps, each one deliberate, and closed the lid with a quiet finality, his hand resting there for a second longer than necessary, as if sealing something back into place. And when he spoke again, his voice had shifted, losing its usual distance. "Some things are not meant to be revisited," he said, and she watched him carefully, her expression unchanged. Yet there was something in her gaze that felt less like curiosity and more like understanding, a recognition that unsettled him far more than ignorance ever could. "Or perhaps," she said after a pause, her voice steady, "they are only meant to be revisited when someone no longer faces them alone." And the words did not challenge him. They did not demand a response. They simply existed, quiet and undeniable, and Adrian felt something inside him tighten, not in resistance, but in something far more dangerous, the sense that she had stepped closer to a truth he had spent years avoiding. And for a moment, he considered leaving, retreating back into the structure that had protected him for so long. But he did not move, because leaving would mean admitting that her presence had already begun to change something. And that was a reality he was not yet prepared to confront. Instead, he turned slightly, his gaze drifting toward the window where the night pressed against the glass in endless darkness. And for the first time, it did not feel as consuming as it once had, as though the quiet behind him had begun to alter its weight. And when he spoke again, the words came without calculation. "Why do you stay?" he asked, not as a command, not as an accusation, but as something closer to uncertainty. And Eliza did not answer immediately. Her silence measured, thoughtful, before she finally said, "Because not every place that feels empty is meant to remain that way." And Adrian closed his eyes for the briefest moment, the words settling into the spaces he had left untouched for years. And when he opened them again, he realized with a clarity that unsettled him deeply, that the house had not changed at all, not the walls, not the corridors, not the shadows that lingered in every corner. The only difference was that she was there, and somehow, impossibly, that had begun to make it feel less like something to endure and more like something he was no longer entirely alone inside. The following days unfolded with a quiet persistence that neither of them acknowledged, yet both began to feel, as though something unseen had taken root within the rigid structure of Blackthorn Estate, altering its rhythm in ways too subtle to name, but too constant to ignore. And Adrian found himself increasingly aware of her presence even when she was not in sight. A shift that unsettled him more than any direct confrontation ever could, because it required nothing from her, no effort, no intention, only existence. And that alone was enough to disrupt the careful distance he had maintained for years. He noticed the way the eastern corridor no longer felt entirely abandoned. The faint scent of lavender that lingered where dust once dominated, the small, deliberate changes that spoke not of intrusion, but of quiet restoration. And though he told himself these details were insignificant, his steps began to turn toward them without conscious thought, drawn by something he could neither justify nor deny. One late afternoon, as the sky stretched into a muted gray that pressed low against the land, Adrian entered the library, a room he had long reduced to function rather than refuge, its shelves untouched, its silence heavy with neglect. Yet now there was movement there, not loud, not disruptive, but steady, and Eliza stood near the far shelf, carefully placing a book back into its proper space, her fingers brushing the spine with a familiarity that suggested she had been there often, quietly reclaiming something that had been left to fade. And for a moment he remained in the doorway, watching, his presence unnoticed, as she paused to read a single line before closing the book again, as though she were piecing together fragments of a story no one had cared to finish. "You seem to make a habit of restoring what is not yours," he said finally, his voice carrying across the room with measured calm. And she turned, her expression composed, neither startled nor defensive, only aware. "I do not see it that way," she replied, her tone even. "Some things are simply waiting for someone to remember them." And the words settled into the quiet space between them, not challenging, not pleading, but steady in a way that made them difficult to dismiss. And Adrian felt the familiar instinct to retreat rise within him, to reduce the moment to something manageable, something that required no response. Yet he did not leave, because leaving would mean returning to a silence that no longer felt as complete as it once had. Instead, he moved further into the room, his steps slow, deliberate, as if approaching something uncertain, and his gaze drifted briefly across the shelves before returning to her. "And you believe that applies to this place?" he asked, the question carrying more weight than he intended, and she met his gaze without hesitation. "I believe it applies to people as well," she said quietly. And there it was again, that subtle crossing of a line he had drawn long ago, not with force, not with defiance, but with a calm certainty that left no room for dismissal. And Adrian felt something within him tighten, not in anger, but in recognition, a quiet, unwelcome understanding that she was not attempting to change him, not asking anything of him, only existing in a way that made change possible. The silence that followed was different from those that had come before, less oppressive, less final, as though it held space for something yet unspoken. And when Adrian finally turned away, it was not with the same urgency that had once defined his movements, but with a measured pause, his hand brushing lightly against the back of a chair as if anchoring himself to something tangible. And as he left the room, he became aware of a realization that unsettled him more than any memory of the past, that the peace he had felt in fleeting moments since her arrival was not accidental, not imagined, but tied, unmistakably, to her presence. And for the first time, he found himself questioning, not whether he should keep his distance, but whether he was already too late to do so. By the end of the week, the change within the house could no longer be dismissed as coincidence, though no one spoke of it aloud. And Adrian found himself caught in a quiet contradiction that unsettled him more than any past memory ever had. Because it was not pain that disturbed him now, but the absence of it in moments he had long accepted as unchangeable. And that absence always seemed to begin and end with her. He noticed it most in the evenings, when the weight of the day usually pressed hardest against him, when the silence of the estate turned from neutral to suffocating. Yet now there were brief intervals where that pressure eased, not completely, not enough to trust, but enough to notice, and he began to anticipate those moments without meaning to, his steps slowing near the eastern wing, his attention drawn toward the faint glow of candlelight that marked her presence like a quiet signal he had not agreed to follow, yet did, one evening, as the wind moved steadily across the grounds and the sky darkened earlier than expected. Adrian entered the corridor and found it empty, the usual light absent, the stillness heavier than before, and something within him shifted in a way he did not immediately understand, a subtle tension, not of anger or irritation, but of something far more unfamiliar, something that resembled disappointment. And it unsettled him enough that he turned toward the servants' quarters without conscious thought, his pace measured but purposeful, until he saw her at the far end of the hall, speaking quietly with the housekeeper, her posture composed, her expression calm. And the moment his eyes found her, that tension eased in a way that was both immediate and deeply unsettling. He stopped before he reached them, as though crossing the final distance would reveal something he was not prepared to face. Yet Eliza noticed him nonetheless, her gaze lifting with quiet awareness. And for a brief second, the conversation around her faded into something distant, irrelevant, leaving only the space between them, unspoken but undeniably present. "You were not in the East Wing," he said when she approached, his voice controlled, yet carrying a weight he had not intended. And she studied him briefly, not questioning, not challenging, only observing in that steady way that had begun to feel dangerously perceptive. "I was needed elsewhere," she replied simply, and though the answer was reasonable, it did not satisfy the question he had not meant to ask, the one that lingered beneath his words, the one he refused to give voice to. Adrian inclined his head, slightly, as if accepting the explanation, yet he did not move away, and the silence that followed was different from before, less distant, more charged with something neither of them acknowledged, until he finally spoke again, quieter this time. "The corridor feels different without you there." And the words seemed to surprise even him, their honesty unguarded in a way he had not permitted in years. And Eliza's expression softened almost imperceptibly, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with something gentler, something that held no expectation. "Places often reflect the people within them," she said, her voice calm. "Sometimes more than we realize." And Adrian exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to notice, as though her presence alone had begun to alter something he could not control, something he was no longer certain he wanted to control. He turned then, as he often did when a moment reached too close to something real, yet this time his steps were slower, less certain, and as he moved away, he became aware of a realization that settled quietly but firmly within him, that the peace he had once believed lost was not returning on its own. It was not something time had restored or distance had softened. It was something that existed only in her presence, something that began when she was near and faded when she was not. And for the first time, Adrian Blackthorne understood with a clarity that left no room for denial, that what he felt was no longer a passing shift, no longer a temporary disruption. It was dependence, quiet and unspoken, but undeniable, and he did not yet know whether that truth would become his salvation or the very thing that would undo him. The days that followed did not announce themselves as turning points. Yet something beneath their quiet repetition began to shift in a way Adrian could no longer ignore, because what had once been distance was now awareness, and what had once been control was slowly becoming something far less certain, something that depended not on his will, but on her presence. He noticed it most in the hours just before dusk, when the lights softened and the house seemed to pause between day and night, and, without intention, his steps carried him once again toward the eastern wing, not with the resistance he had once felt, but with a quiet inevitability that unsettled him more than any deliberate choice could have. And when he reached the corridor, he found her there, standing near the window where the fading light traced the outline of her figure, her hands resting lightly on the sill as she looked out across the distant fields, as though she were searching for something beyond the boundaries of the estate, something that existed outside the stillness that defined his world. He stopped a few feet away, not announcing his presence, not needing to, because she seemed to sense him without turning, her posture shifting almost imperceptibly, as though acknowledging something familiar rather than unexpected. And when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, yet clear in the quiet space. You walk these halls as if you were trying to outrun something, and the observation settled between them, with a quiet certainty that left no room for dismissal, and Adrian felt the instinct to deflect rise within him, to reduce her words to something simple, something inconsequential, yet he did not speak immediately, because denying it would require more effort than he was willing to give. Some things do not wait to be outrun, he answered at last, his tone measured, yet lacking the sharp edge it once carried, and she turned then, meeting his gaze with that same steady calm that had begun to feel less like curiosity and more like understanding. No, she said quietly, but some things do not follow as closely when you stop pretending they are not there. And for a moment, the silence that followed was not empty, but full, filled with the weight of something neither of them named, and Adrian became aware of a subtle shift within himself, not a breaking, not a surrender, but a loosening, as though the rigid structure he had built around his thoughts had begun to give way, not under force, but under something far more dangerous, acceptance. He moved closer to the window then, his gaze drifting outward, though he did not truly see the landscape beyond, because his attention remained anchored to the quiet presence beside him. And after a moment, he spoke again, the words coming without the careful restraint he had relied on for so long. You speak as if you understand. And she did not hesitate, did not withdraw from the implication. I understand what it means to stay somewhere that does not feel like it was meant for you, she replied, her voice steady. And I understand what it means to realize that leaving does not always take that feeling away. And something in her words resonated with a depth he could not ignore, not because they revealed anything new, but because they reflected something he had never allowed himself to acknowledge, that the emptiness he carried was not bound to the walls of this house. It was something he had brought with him, something that had followed him long before she ever arrived. The realization settled quietly, without urgency, without demand, and Adrian exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing just enough to notice, as though her presence had begun to change not only the space around him, but the way he occupied it. And when he finally turned away from the window, it was not with the same need to retreat that had defined his actions before, but with a measured calm that felt unfamiliar, yet not unwelcome. And as he walked past her, his voice lowered, almost thoughtful. You do not belong here, he said, not as a dismissal, but as a statement he no longer understood, and she watched him. With quiet certainty, her expression unchanged as she answered, perhaps not. And then, after a brief pause that carried more weight than the words themselves, but neither do you. And Adrian did not respond. Because for the first time, he was no longer certain that he wanted to prove her wrong. The words she left behind did not fade as Adrian expected them to. They lingered instead, quiet but persistent, settling into the spaces he had once kept untouched. And for the first time in years, he found himself carrying a thought he could not dismiss, not because it was loud or demanding, but because it felt undeniably true, and that truth followed him through the corridors, through the hours that had once passed without meaning. until even the familiar structure of his days began to feel altered by it. He did not return to the eastern wing that evening, not out of indifference, but because something within him hesitated, as though crossing that distance again would confirm a shift he was not yet ready to name. And so he remained in his study, the fire low, the silence pressing in with its usual weight, yet it no longer felt complete, as though something essential had been removed, leaving behind an absence he could not ignore. The clock marked each passing minute with quiet precision, and Adrian found himself listening to it in a way he never had before, not as a measure of time, but as a reminder of something missing, something that had begun to define the edges of his awareness without his consent. And it was only when the hour grew late, when the house had settled into its deepest stillness, that he rose without conscious decision and moved toward the corridor once more, his steps measured, yet guided by something that felt less like intention and more like necessity. The eastern wing greeted him with the familiar dim light of a single candle, its glow steady against the surrounding dark, and she was there, seated as she often was, her presence quiet yet unmistakable. And the moment his eyes found her, the tension that had followed him throughout the evening eased in a way that was both immediate and deeply unsettling, as though something within him had been waiting for this exact moment without his awareness. He did not speak at first, and neither did she, yet the silence between them was no longer distant, no longer empty. It carried a quiet understanding that neither of them needed to define, and when he finally stepped closer, his voice was lower than before, less guarded. "You should not say things like that," he said, not with accusation, but with a restraint that hinted at something deeper, and she looked up at him, her gaze steady, unafraid. "Only if they are not true," she replied, and the simplicity of her answer left no room for deflection, no space to retreat into the careful distance he had relied on for so long. Adrian exhaled slowly, his attention drifting briefly to the candlelight before returning to her, as though grounding himself in something tangible. "You assume too much," he said. Yet the words lacked their usual certainty, and she did not challenge them, did not press further. She only watched him with that same quiet awareness, and it was that restraint, that absence of expectation, that unsettled him most, because it left him alone with the truth he had begun to recognize. He moved closer still, the space between them narrowing to something almost tangible, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence deepening into something that felt less like absence and more like presence, until Adrian found himself saying what he had not intended to say. This place was not meant to hold anything beyond what it is. And the admission was quiet, almost distant, yet it carried a weight that lingered in the air between them. And Eliza's expression softened, not with pity, not with triumph, but with something far more dangerous, understanding. "Places change," she said gently, "when the people inside them begin to change." And Adrian closed his eyes for a brief second, the words settling into him with a clarity he could no longer deny, because the change she spoke of was not something he could attribute to time or circumstance. It was something that had begun the moment she arrived, something that existed only in her presence. And when he opened his eyes again, he realized with a quiet certainty that unsettled him deeply, that the peace he had begun to feel was no longer something he could separate from her. It was something that belonged to her presence alone, and for the first time, he understood that what he was facing was not a passing shift, not a temporary disruption, but a truth that would demand something from him eventually, something he had spent years avoiding. And as he stood there in the dim light, closer to her than he had ever allowed himself to be, Adrian Blackthorne recognized with a clarity that left no room for denial that he was no longer trying to keep his distance. He was trying to understand how much of himself he had already lost to the quiet, unspoken need for her presence, and whether that loss was something he could ever take back. The realization did not arrive as a single moment, but as a quiet accumulation of small, undeniable truths that Adrian could no longer separate from the presence that had begun to reshape the silence of his world. And in the days that followed, he found himself no longer resisting the pull that led him toward her, not because he had accepted it, but because denying it required more effort than he was willing to give. And that alone unsettled him more than any past wound ever had. The house continued as it always had, its routines unchanged, its corridors still carrying the echo of something long absent. Yet within that constancy, there was a difference that could not be ignored, a subtle shift in the way the air seemed to settle, the way the quiet no longer pressed as heavily against him when she was near, and Adrian began to recognize that what he had once called control had never truly been stability. It had only been absence, the absence of anything that could reach him, disturb him, or demand something he was not prepared to give. One afternoon, as the muted light filtered through the tall windows and stretched across the stone floors in long, pale lines, Adrian entered the eastern wing without hesitation, his steps guided by something that felt less like choice and more like certainty. And he found her near the same window where their conversations had become something unspoken yet expected, her attention fixed on the distant horizon as though she were measuring something beyond the reach of the estate, something that did not belong to the walls that had defined his life for so long. "You look beyond this place as if it does not hold you," he said, his voice quieter than before, lacking the guarded distance that had once shaped every word. And she turned slowly, her gaze meeting his with that same calm awareness that had begun to feel less like observation and more like recognition. "Because it does not," she answered simply, and the honesty of her reply did not carry defiance, only truth. And it settled into the space between them with a weight Adrian could not dismiss. He moved closer, not with urgency, not with intent, but with a quiet inevitability that had begun to define his actions whenever she was near. And for a moment, he said nothing, his gaze shifting from her to the window and back again, as though searching for something he could not name, until he spoke again, more deliberately this time. "And yet you remain." And she held his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged. "Because leaving has never guaranteed belonging," she said, and the words resonated with a depth that reached further than he was prepared to acknowledge, because they reflected something he had long refused to confront, that the emptiness he carried was not bound to this place. It had followed him long before he ever stepped within these walls, and it would remain long after, unless something within him changed. The silence that followed was not empty, but full, filled with the weight of something neither of them named. And Adrian became aware of a shift within himself, not a sudden transformation, not a breaking of the past, but a quiet acceptance of something he had resisted for far too long, that the peace he had begun to feel was not something that existed independently. It was not a return of what had been lost. It was something entirely new, something that existed only in the presence of the woman standing before him. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing just enough to notice, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a clarity that had not been there before. "Then what is it that keeps you here?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a question he needed answered, and she did not respond immediately, her gaze softening almost imperceptibly as she considered his words, before she answered with quiet certainty. "Perhaps the same thing that keeps you from leaving." And the simplicity of her response left no room for denial, no space for retreat, and Adrian felt something within him shift, not in resistance, but in recognition, because for the first time, he understood that what he felt was no longer something he could distance himself from. It was something he had already begun to accept, whether he was ready to admit it or not. And as he stood there in the fading light, closer to her than he had ever allowed himself to be, he realized with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that the world he had built around himself was no longer enough, and the quiet presence that had entered it without belonging had become the only place where he no longer felt the need to escape. The question she left hanging between them did not demand an answer, yet Adrian carried it with him long after the moment had passed, its quiet certainty echoing through the corridors of his thoughts in a way that no command, no memory, had managed to do in years, and for the first time, he did not attempt to silence it, because somewhere beneath the resistance he had relied on for so long, there was a growing awareness that the answer she implied was not something he could deny without also denying the change that had already begun within him. The following morning arrived with a stillness that felt different from the ones before, not lighter, not brighter, but less suffocating, as though the weight he had grown accustomed to had shifted just enough to allow something else to exist beside it. And Adrian found himself pausing at the threshold of his study, his attention drifting not to the tasks that awaited him, but to the quiet expectation that had begun to define the rhythm of his days, the unspoken knowledge that at some point, without intention or plan, his steps would lead him back to her. Yet this time, when he entered the eastern wing, he found it empty, the candle unlit, the window closed, and the absence was immediate, unmistakable, settling into him with a sharp clarity that disrupted the fragile balance he had only just begun to understand. And for a moment, he stood there, unmoving, as though the space itself had changed in her absence, the quiet no longer carrying the same presence, the same sense of something held together by more than just stone and silence. He moved further into the corridor, his gaze searching without purpose, until he turned toward the main hall, his steps measured but lacking the certainty that had guided him before. And it was only when he reached the far side of the estate that he saw her, standing near the open doors that led to the outer grounds, her figure framed by the pale light of the overcast sky, her posture still, yet resolute, as though she were preparing for something he had not anticipated. "You intend to leave," he said, the words forming before he had fully considered them, and she turned at the sound of his voice, her expression calm, yet carrying a quiet finality that unsettled him more than any sudden departure could have. "I was asked to deliver something to the village," she replied, her tone steady, and it seemed unwise to refuse. And though the explanation was simple, it did not ease the tension that had already begun to settle within him, because it was not the act of leaving that disturbed him. It was the realization that she could leave at all, that her presence, which had begun to feel like something constant, something certain, was not bound to this place in the way he had come to rely on. Adrian stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing in a way that felt less deliberate than inevitable. And for a moment, he said nothing, as though the words he needed did not yet exist in a form he could use, until finally, his voice lowered, carrying a weight he did not attempt to conceal. "You did not think to inform me." And she met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged. "I did not think it necessary," she said simply. And the honesty of her answer struck deeper than any apology could have, because it revealed a truth he had not been prepared to face, that whatever existed between them, whatever had begun to take shape in the quiet spaces they shared, it was not something she viewed as binding, not something that required permission or acknowledgement. The realization settled heavily, not as anger, not as resentment, but as something far more unsettling, the recognition that what he had begun to feel was his alone, unspoken, undefined, and therefore fragile in a way he could not control. And Adrian exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting briefly beyond her to the distant path that stretched toward the village, as though measuring the distance she would place between them, before returning to her once more. "You should not go alone," he said, the words softer now, less command than concern, and for the first time, something in her expression shifted, not in resistance, but in quiet acknowledgement. "I have done so before," she replied, and there was no pride in the statement, only truth, and Adrian nodded slightly, though the gesture felt insufficient, as though it failed to address the weight of what remained unspoken between them. And as she turned to leave, stepping beyond the threshold into the open air, he became aware of a certainty that settled within him with undeniable clarity, that the peace he had begun to find was not something he could hold on to in her absence. And as he watched her figure move further down the path, gradually blending into the muted landscape beyond, Adrian Blackthorne realized with a quiet, unyielding truth that for the first time in years, he was not waiting for the day to pass. He was waiting for her to return, and that realization, more than anything else, revealed just how much had already changed. The hours stretched longer than they should have, not because the day demanded more of him, but because something within Adrian refused to settle in the absence that had replaced the quiet he had come to rely on. And though the estate continued its steady rhythm, unchanged in its structure and expectations, it no longer felt the same to him, as though the silence that once defined it had lost something essential, something he had not realized he depended on until it was no longer there. He remained in his study for a time, attempting to return to the familiar order of ledgers and correspondence, yet the numbers blurred, the words failed to hold his attention, and more than once, he found himself pausing without reason, his gaze drifting toward the window that overlooked the distant path leading away from the estate, as though he could measure the passage of time by the distance she had already traveled, though he knew such a thought held no logic, only the quiet insistence of something he could no longer dismiss. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened into a low, heavy gray, the kind that suggested the approach of a storm, and Adrian stood at the window longer than necessary, his posture still, his thoughts unsettled in a way that no external circumstance could justify. Because it was not the weather that concerned him, it was the absence that had begun to shape every moment since she had left, the realization that the sense of calm he had begun to understand was not something he could summon on his own. It was something that existed only in her presence. And without it, the familiar weight of his world returned with a clarity that felt sharper than before. He turned away at last, moving through the corridors with measured steps that carried an edge of restlessness he did not attempt to conceal, until he reached the main hall once more, his attention drawn toward the open doors that framed the distant grounds, now dim beneath the gathering clouds. And for a moment, he remained there, as though the threshold itself marked something more than the boundary of the estate, something that separated what he had been from what he was beginning to understand. The wind had picked up, moving steadily across the open fields, and as the first drops of rain began to fall, Adrian stepped forward, not with urgency, but with a quiet certainty that left no room for hesitation, his gaze fixed on the path that stretched into the distance, now blurred by the shifting weather, and though he could not see her, not yet, he felt the absence of her presence with a clarity that left no space for doubt. He had spent years believing that distance was safety, that detachment was control, yet now, standing at the edge of the world he had built for himself, he understood with a certainty that unsettled him deeply, that distance had never protected him from anything. It had only ensured that nothing could reach him at all, and the quiet presence that had entered his life without permission had undone that illusion without effort, simply by existing. The rain grew heavier, the wind sharper, yet Adrian did not retreat, his gaze fixed on the path as though waiting for something that had become far more than a passing thought, until at last, through the shifting gray of the storm, a figure appeared, distant at first, then clearer with each passing second, moving steadily toward the estate despite the weather. And the moment he recognized her, the tension that had settled within him since her departure eased in a way that was both immediate and undeniable, as though something essential had returned to its place without asking for permission. He stepped forward without realizing it, closing the distance between himself and the open grounds, his voice quieter than it had ever been, though she was still too far to hear. "You should not have gone," he said, not as a command, not as reproach, but as something far more revealing, an acknowledgement of what her absence had made clear. And as she continued toward him, the rain tracing faint lines against her coat, her expression calm despite the storm, Adrian Blackthorne understood with a clarity that left no room for denial, that whatever existed between them was no longer something he could observe from a distance. It was something he had already stepped into, something that had begun to define not only the silence of his world, but the man he was becoming within it. And for the first time, he did not turn away from that truth. The moment she stepped beneath the shelter of the estate, the rain still clinging to the edges of her coat, something within Adrian settled with a certainty he could no longer question, as though the restless tension that had followed him throughout the day had finally found its resolution in her return. And yet that realization did not bring the comfort he might have expected. It brought something far more demanding, the quiet understanding that what he felt was no longer something he could dismiss as temporary or incidental. It was something that required acknowledgement. Eliza paused just inside the threshold, her gaze lifting to meet his, her expression composed despite the storm she had walked through. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled with something deeper than words, something that carried the weight of what had remained unspoken until now. "You should not have gone alone," Adrian said at last, his voice steady, yet lacking the distance it once held, and she studied him for a moment, as though considering not the words themselves, but the meaning beneath them. "I have done so before," she replied, her tone calm, yet there was a quiet shift in her expression, something that suggested she understood more than she chose to say. Adrian stepped closer then, the space between them narrowing in a way that felt less deliberate than inevitable. And for a moment, he simply looked at her, as though confirming that she was truly there, that the absence he had felt was no longer present. And when he spoke again, his voice lowered, carrying a weight that left no room for misinterpretation. "That does not mean you should continue to do so." And the words were not a command, not an attempt to assert control, but something far more revealing: concern, unguarded and undeniable. Eliza held his gaze, her expression unchanged, yet her voice softened slightly as she answered, "You speak as though my absence unsettled you." And the simplicity of her observation left no space for deflection, no room for the careful distance he had once relied on, and Adrian exhaled slowly, the truth of it settling into him with a clarity he could no longer deny. Because it was no longer a matter of interpretation, it was something he had experienced with undeniable certainty. "It did," he said quietly, and the admission hung between them, unembellished, unguarded, carrying more weight than anything he had said before. And for a moment, the world beyond the estate seemed to fall away, leaving only the space between them, defined not by distance, but by something far more fragile, something that had begun to take shape without either of them naming it. Eliza's gaze did not waver, yet something in her expression shifted, not in surprise, not in triumph, but in quiet understanding, as though she had been waiting for him to reach this point on his own, without pressure, without expectation. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, yet softer than before. "And yet you let me go," she said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. And Adrian felt the weight of those words settle into him with a quiet force, because they revealed something he had not yet considered, that allowing her to leave had not been an act of indifference, but of uncertainty, a hesitation born from the realization that what he felt was something he could not control. He turned slightly, his gaze shifting briefly toward the storm beyond the doors before returning to her once more. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a clarity that had not been there before. "I did not understand what it meant," he said. And the admission was simple, yet it carried the weight of everything that had changed since her arrival. And Eliza watched him carefully, her expression unreadable for a moment before she replied, "And now?" And the question remained unfinished, yet its meaning was unmistakable. And Adrian held her gaze, the silence stretching just long enough to make the answer feel inevitable. "Now I do," he said, and in that moment, there was no distance left between them, no barrier of pretense or restraint, only the quiet certainty of something that had already begun to define them both. And as the storm continued beyond the walls of the estate, Adrian Blackthorne realized with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that whatever he had once believed about control, about distance, about the safety of solitude, it no longer applied, because the peace he had found was no longer something he could separate from her. It was something that existed only in her presence, and for the first time, he did not attempt to deny it. The quiet that followed his admission did not feel uncertain. It felt inevitable, as though something long restrained had finally found its place between them, and Adrian remained where he stood, no longer searching for distance, no longer retreating into the silence that had once defined him, because for the first time, that silence did not offer him refuge. It only reminded him of what it lacked when she was not there. Eliza did not step away, did not shift the moment into something lighter or easier. She simply remained, her presence steady, her gaze unwavering. And it was that stillness that held the weight of everything he had yet to say, everything he had spent years refusing to acknowledge, until even the air between them felt changed by it. "You understand now," she said quietly, not as a question, but as something already known. And Adrian inclined his head slightly, his expression no longer guarded in the way it once had been. "I understand enough to know that I should have spoken sooner," he replied, his voice measured, yet carrying a depth that had not been there before, and the words settled between them with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not forceful, but undeniable in their truth. Eliza studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful, as though weighing not the words themselves, but the meaning behind them. And when she spoke again, her voice was softer, though no less certain. "And what would you have said?" she asked, and the question lingered, not demanding, not urgent, but impossible to ignore, and Adrian felt the weight of it settle within him. Because for the first time, he did not search for a way to avoid the answer. He searched for the words that would hold it. He stepped closer. Then, the distance between them narrowing until it no longer felt like a space that needed to be measured, and for a moment, he did not speak, his gaze steady on hers, as though ensuring that what he was about to say would not be lost in hesitation. "I would have said that this place no longer feels as it did before you arrived," he began, his voice low, deliberate, "and that I no longer move through it as I once did." And he paused briefly, not out of uncertainty, but because the next words carried a weight he had never allowed himself to speak aloud. "I would have said that the quiet I once relied on has changed, and that I have begun to understand why." And Eliza's gaze did not waver, though something in her expression softened, not in surprise, but in recognition, as though she had seen this moment approaching long before he had. Adrian exhaled slowly, the tension that had once defined his every word no longer present, replaced by something steadier, something far more difficult to deny. "I would have said that when you are not here, this place returns to something I no longer wish to endure," he continued, and the truth of it settled into the space between them with a clarity that left no room for retreat, and that when you are here, it becomes something else entirely. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of his words filling the silence with something that no longer needed to be named. Eliza lowered her gaze briefly, not in avoidance, but in quiet reflection, before lifting it once more to meet his, and when she spoke, her voice carried a calm certainty that matched his own. "And what does that make me?" she asked, and the question, though simple, held everything within it. Every unspoken truth, every realization that had led them to this moment, and Adrian did not hesitate this time, because the answer was no longer something he needed to find. It was something he had already understood. "It makes you the only place where I am no longer trying to leave," he said, and the words settled between them with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but certain in a way that could not be undone. And as the storm beyond the walls began to fade into a steady, distant rhythm, Adrian Blackthorne stood in the stillness that followed, no longer defined by the absence he had carried for so long, but by the presence that had changed it. And for the first time, he did not question whether that change would remain, because he already knew that it would. The silence that followed his words did not break. It settled, deeper and more certain than anything that had come before, as though the truth he had finally spoken had reshaped the very air between them. And Adrian remained where he stood, no longer searching for distance, no longer questioning what this moment meant, because for the first time in years, he was not trying to understand something in order to control it. He was simply allowing it to exist. Eliza did not respond immediately, her gaze steady, thoughtful, as though she was not surprised by what he had said, only acknowledging that he had finally reached the place she had quietly seen from the beginning. And when she spoke, her voice carried no urgency, no expectation, only a calm certainty that matched his own. "And what happens when I am not here?" she asked, not as a challenge, but as a truth that could not be avoided. And Adrian felt the weight of the question settle into him, not as doubt, but as something that required honesty, the kind he had only just begun to allow himself. He turned slightly, his gaze drifting toward the corridor that stretched beyond them, the familiar stone walls now carrying a different presence than they once had. And for a moment, he considered what his answer would have been weeks ago, before she arrived, before anything had changed, and the contrast between that past certainty and his present understanding was undeniable. "Then I would have to learn how to carry that peace without losing it," he said at last, his voice steady, not hesitant, because the truth no longer frightened him in the way it once had. "But I do not believe it would exist in the same way." And the admission was quiet, yet it held everything within it. The recognition that what she had brought into his life was not something that could be replaced or recreated. It was something singular, something tied to her in a way he no longer attempted to deny. Eliza watched him carefully, her expression softening in a way that did not diminish her strength, but revealed something equally steady beneath it. And when she stepped closer, the movement was unhurried, natural, as though it required no decision, only acceptance. "Then perhaps it is not something meant to be carried alone," she said, and the simplicity of her words settled into him with a clarity that felt both new and familiar, as though it had always been true, waiting only for him to be ready to hear it. Adrian met her gaze, and in that moment, there was no distance left between what he had been and what he was becoming, no barrier of silence or restraint, only the quiet certainty of something that had grown without force, without demand, until it had become undeniable. And he understood then that this was not about losing control, not about surrendering to something uncertain. It was about recognizing that what he had once called strength had only been isolation, and that what he now felt was something far more enduring, something that did not weaken him, but allowed him to exist beyond the confines he had created for himself. The storm beyond the estate had faded into a distant rhythm, the rain no longer sharp against the windows, but steady, almost calm, and the house itself seemed to reflect that change, the silence no longer empty, but full, carrying a presence that had not been there before. And Adrian realized that the world he had once endured had not been replaced, it had been transformed, not by force, not by time, but by the quiet arrival of someone who had never claimed to belong, yet had become essential in a way he could no longer separate from himself. He exhaled slowly, the tension that had once defined him no longer present, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but certain in a way that required no emphasis. "Then stay," he said, not as a command, not as a plea, but as something far more grounded, an acknowledgement of what already was. And Eliza did not answer with words, because she did not need to. The absence of refusal, the absence of distance, was answer enough. And as the quiet settled around them once more, Adrian Blackthorne stood in a place that no longer felt like something to endure, but something to remain within. And for the first time, he understood that peace was not something found in isolation. It was something recognized in the presence of the one who saw him without asking him to be anything other than what he was. And that understanding did not demand more words. It did not require a promise. It simply existed, steady and unspoken, in the space they now shared.